Hey, CNFers, the frontrunner, The Life of Steve Prefontaine is available for pre-order. Most authors are always begging for pre-orders. It's part of the game. So, you only have so much at your disposal. I'll just say, please consider it. And promotional support, you're running out of time, is brought to you by the Power of Narrative Conference, celebrating its 26th year on the last weekend of March 28th and the 29th. Hundreds of journalists from around the world are descending on Boston University to hear from the likes of Susan Orlean, Connie Schultz, and Dan Zak, not to mention Connie Chung as a closing keynote speaker. Listeners to this podcast can get 15% off your enrollment fee by using the code CNF15. If you go to combeyond.bu.edu, use that code CNF15
like,
for a little extra
I'm
scratch
a fake
in your
journalist.
pocket.
I'm a fake writer. What am I doing? I don't know.
Hey, CNFers, I got this wicked series of knots under my left scapula. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I talk to tellers of true tales about the true tales they tell. Get used to a few weeks of double features as I try and get through the backlog of interviews. Today's early drop is Will McGrath, who wrote the amazing reported essay American Boys, following a high school basketball team in Minnesota for a season. He wrote it for The Believer, so visit thebeliever.net to check it out. Maybe add it to your list of subscriptions. Up to you. I don't get kickbacks. It's a beautiful magazine, and it's definitely one of those feather-in-your-cap magazines to write for. Anyway, show notes to this episode and more at brendanamara.com. Hey, there you can read blog posts, follow my anti-social media feed, and sign up for my flagship newsletter, Rage Against the Algorithm. Book recommendations, cool links, hot goss. It's all there. My latest issue, Anatomy of a Book Advance, was pretty popular with subscribers. I got a lot of emails back about it. Shed some light on the mechanics of mine for the Prefontaine book. Next one could be different. It could be less, could be more. My living situation might change. Stay tuned. Also, I can't believe I'm saying this. It's okay. It's okay. I'm experimenting with a Substack specifically for the podcast, Creative Nonfiction Podcast.substack.com. That will come out as a companion for each interview. Full transcripts, nearly accurate. They don't get 100% there, but even after I comb through them, they're pretty good, but not wholly there. And a bit more sauce for each episode. It'll be like show notes on the juice. I might scrap it after a few months, but I like the idea of each podcast having its own newsletter. My big mistake a few months ago was taking my existing Rager audience, doing that once a week for a bit to coincide with the pod, and I lost more than 5% of my list in a month's time. And I'm only now fully starting to reclaim that. So, starting this new list, and maybe that'll appeal to you if you want transcripts, The Parting Shot, and other podcast ephemera. That's where we're at. Will McGrath has worked as a reporter, homeless shelter caseworker, UPS truck loader, public radio producer, Burger King chicken sandwich mayo applicator, ghostwriter, ghost editor, in slightly different order. He's the author of the books Everything Lost is Found Again, 4 seasons in Lesotho, and Farewell Transmission, Notes from Hidden Spaces. This piece for The Believer ran over the fall of 2024. We recorded this in November. So yeah, working our way through, man. Great conversation. I'm sure you'll love it. Parting shot on staying the course. But for now, here's me and Will Riff. At what point do you kind of get the journalism bug, or at least this idea of really loving, true stories and narrative nonfiction?
I mean, I've been interested in writing in general for a long time, since I was little. But I I spent some of my first couple of jobs post college. I worked at a homeless shelter in Arizona. Was this first kind of big job, and it was an amazing job, and it was a world that I was not previously exposed to, living a very kind of like privileged, sheltered upbringing. There were just so many interesting people I would talk to on a daily basis and people that I became close with. One of the first things that I wrote that was kind of in that world was about a person that, like, he was an old man who I knew well and was like a lovely person, and was murdered one night, just like overnight,
Mm.
out in the street. And it really affected everyone in the community. And I wrote like an obituary for him, and kind of like this essayistic obituary for this guy, just because, I mean, he had no family connections that anyone knew of. There was just some instinct to kind of memorialize this person that I knew, and I'm sure it was as much for me as it was for any kind of outward purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But that was kind of one of the first times I can remember doing something that was just straight nonfiction. It felt important to me in some way. So I think that kind of got things rolling.
What was the response to that?
It was just published in the kind of little local homeless community newspaper, and it was, people appreciated it, and just feeling like here was someone being seen and acknowledged and celebrated, who probably most of the people in the the city of Phoenix, Arizona, he was entirely invisible to. So I think people in that community, at least, really appreciated being recognized and made visible. And then I later on, I did another job that was I was working at a shelter in Ann Arbor, Michigan for a while, and spent a lot of time in that role. And then ultimately, some of those stories made it um, into my second book. Of So I think it got started at this Arizona job, and then it just became a thing. It was like, a way that I moved through those communities, of feeling like there were so many fascinating, important stories here that were invisible to the kind of, normal world, that it became an instinct to want to celebrate these lives that were kind of on the fringes of things.
Well, you've got a story idea, and you're starting to think of how to pitch it. When do you know, or when do you feel ready that you're like, okay, there's enough meat on the bone here. Now I feel like I can go out and try to sell this thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I feel like I've done it wrong most of my
Me too.
most of my
Oh my
life.
God, I'm so bad at it. Yeah.
But I don't have any formal journalism training. So I, like, this world really stumbled my way into, because maybe a sense of insecurity, or imposter syndrome in that realm. I do a ton of research and reading ahead of time, to the point where I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on something. But where I say uh, that I have done it wrong, many times, I don't even know if I should say most times, have just written the piece, written a draft of the piece before I've pitched places.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, sometimes, as things have gone on a little bit more recently, I've pitched ideas. It's taken me a long time to get to that place where I felt confident enough to just pitch based on an idea, as opposed to just writing essentially a pretty well done draft first. I mean, I never originally saw myself as a journalist. I was, writing things, and I think significantly for my own, pleasure and interest. Once I had something that I felt really good about, and some of these things are kind of like earlier essay type things, then I felt I could, send it out into the world. I certainly just felt much more confident if I had a thing that I had written. I think this is pretty good. I felt much more confident sending that to people than doing the traditional pitching way. Unfortunate aspect of this kind of journalism is so much of it, to some extent you're kind of funding yourself, or you get interested in an idea and you're just pursuing it, and then you get to a point where you think, oh, maybe maybe there's a way for me to get reimbursed for the the expense I've put into this project already. This one thing specifically I can think of doing this very backwards, but this is a story that I wrote for Pacific Standard magazine, now dearly departed, but it was a truly excellent magazine that I can't remember when it was about 2020 or something like that, that their funding dried up, but they were kind of concerned with, social issues, environmental issues. And I did a story about, in Colorado, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, this place that was a former military base that had become, some people had turned into essentially like a Betty Ford clinic for unhoused people. And it was just kind of like, come out to this old army base that's been refurbished and dry out and get yourself right, and then we'll help you find housing. But it was like a community out in the middle of nowhere that had, a couple hundred people living out there, and then a full-time staff. And I just thought it was such an interesting kind of vision and concept, because at the time, at least, it was kind of out of step with some of how, homelessness work and theory goes, where, a lot of times people now are saying, get people housed first and then address the underlying issues. And that's a totally valid way to go about it. But this place was having success doing kind of the reverse. But I had done a ton of research on the place and been in contact with the people out there. And I had pitched the story to this magazine, Pacific Standard, and the editor was interested in it. But I didn't quite get a straight answer. And eventually I was like, I'm just going to go out there. And then, so I went out there and spent a few days living out at the place. And partway through my time out there, I had been back in touch with the editor, and they were like, okay, yeah, go ahead. We're interested. But I was, like well invested, including, flying myself out to Colorado to take part in this project before it officially got, green lit. And then I thought, okay, well, I'm going to at least get my airfare taken care of here. But yeah, so many times I have done it backwards and wrong. And I mean, I'm sure that's true for so many people that you're just figuring out.
But there's in your piece for The Believer, I love early on where you wrote that I'm a lifelong basketball junkie with a mild anti-authoritarian streak. And as such, the young men playing their general gameplay shot lightning bolts into my limbic system. And you go on to say that you approached the coach with the idea of wanting to follow them for a season. So take us to that moment of how you lobby someone for this access and build that kind of trust so you can write a story of this nature.
Yeah. So I had gotten interested in this team and started following them kind of casually and going to some games. And once I got to the point where I was like, I really feel invested in this idea. And I approached the coach, and she was, fairly wary at first, reasonably. I later found out that she had had a previous experience with a journalist who wrote about the team in a way that was ultimately kind of problematic and did not go over well with the players involved. And so she had already kind of felt burned once before. And, like she's a figure of trust in the community, and I think felt like she had let people down. And I mean, you don't know how someone's, gonna write about something until it's out there. So I was coming into this situation where there was already a sense of wariness about it. And partly what I did was, like I had my first book out at that point, which is about a tiny country in southern Africa where my wife and I had lived for a couple of years. I was like, this is some of my previous work where I wanted to talk with her. And so eventually we went out to lunch, and I was able to kind of do more than just a quick little elevator pitch. But I talked with her, for a couple hours out at lunch, of kind of saying like the way I approach these things. So my wife is an anthropologist, which is partly what has led us to travel around about and be, in lots of different communities where we're not from originally. Anthropology has a kind of mindset of, you are going into a space, an environment, a community that is not your space. And you need to tread very carefully when you're in a situation like that. And you need to think very deeply and carefully about issues of power dynamics and about, the cultural baggage you bring into any encounter, and just how you move carefully through a situation like that. So I felt that my first book demonstrated that I could move thoughtfully through places like that where I was not, naturally a part of. And so I gave her my first book and had this long lunch with her, kind of talking through what I felt were, how I wanted to approach this story and the level of attention that I wanted to put into thinking about what my dynamic was as a white writer writing about an all black team and, moving through spaces that were, all black spaces for the most part and Somali spaces. I had enough time ultimately to kind of show her that I had thought through, my position, my positionality in the world, as they sometimes say in the anthropology field. And she was convinced enough to at least like give me kind of a shot to start hanging out with the team, and told made sure the players knew what I was doing there. It's just like hanging out. And then over time, partly with a story like this, I've spent so much time with these people and in this community that eventually people come to kind of get a sense of who you are and feel like if you're a trustworthy person, and what, do you have some alternate agenda? So eventually it became just a matter of putting in the time and developing that trust with people.
How closely related would you say, this kind of immersion, fly on the wall journalism is to anthropology?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely something that kind of underlies the way I think about being a journalist. If I want to call myself that term, I often feel that I'm more or less a fake journalist, but maybe everyone feels like that.
Why is that?
I mean, I feel like just because I don't have formal training in this world, and just because I don't know, I'm sure it's just like, the imposter syndrome that everyone feels. If we're going to apply this journalist term to me, I definitely think of it from an anthropological point of view. From an anthropological perspective, you're thinking about my way of seeing and understanding the world is not the default way of seeing and understanding the world. It is true for me and maybe for some other people in my community, but you quickly just learn to think about the absolute subjectivity with which you encounter the world. As a journalist, I think that's super important to come to any situation working to put your own perspective and your own, assumptions about something on the back burner, and to just, mainly listen and just, you approach a place on its own terms. So you, as much as you can, learn about the place, the space ahead of time, and just try to listen carefully and observe without, as much as possible, without bringing your own understandings of, how something should be to bear on that situation, and just observe and talk with people about how that space operates.
And what are some of the tools that you rely on for your reporting and your information gathering?
I, especially for a story like this, I was gonna say that I'm an unserious person, but that might not be the right way to phrase it. In many ways, I'm take what I do very seriously. I think I'm not a self-serious person. I'm I so in this story where I was working for a long time, and I'm still involved with working with teenage boys, I'm kind of like, yeah, my brain's still more or less the headspace of a 16-year-old. So I think I bring to bear a certain unself-seriousness and a goofiness to some of the ways that I interact with people and interact in the world. It's not performative. That is who I am. But I hope that it makes people feel comfortable and realize that, like, I'm never going to be a writer or journalist who's, trying to take someone down. There
Mm-hmm.
are people out there in the world who need taking down, and there are good journalists who are especially attuned to that kind of thing. But that is never going to be my way of approaching writing, approaching journalism. I'm so much more interested in learning people's stories and celebrating these stories that, I celebrating stories that I think people should be paying attention to. So I think I come to the proceedings with a sense of goofiness and
Mm-hmm.
joyfulness that hopefully the people that I'm working with and interviewing and observing feel comfortable in my that I'm not after anyone.
Yeah, it's suitable. I've worked with people who are like that and suited for it and totally get off on that kind of adrenaline rush of breaking news. I'm more on the other thing. You know what? I'm just gonna sit back. I'm just gonna observe. That's just John McPheesian. That's just kind of how I
Right.
operate, and that's why I locked into him early on. Like, and that's why Survival of the Bark Canoe is like my gold star book. I just can't get
Yeah.
enough of that book of just like hanging out with some weirdo and going out into the woods while he builds
Right.
canoes.
And when you say, I mean, hanging out, this is one of those other ways that I kind of think of like the anthropological crossover is, but I've heard people describe anthropology as deep hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like the whole thing is like you are investing to spend time with people and to get comfortable with people and just hang out. And it's the minutia of everyday life. It's the quotidian stuff that is actually really interesting. So that, came into play a lot in this article in the most fun way of, I'm I spent, you know, and I've been now years kind of involved with this project in a bigger way, but it's pretty fun when, you know, when your work is like, oh, time to go hang out at the gym with these hilarious guys and just like talk shit and shoot hoops and listen to their hilarious dumb stories and tell my own hilarious dumb stories. And you know, it's not a bad gig if you can get it.
How long did it take you, or for the people you were following, to eventually almost you just kind of blended into the background? About how long do you feel like that took?
I probably never blended into the background exactly, but I can remember, you know, I've been at a lot of practices, you know, several weeks, and, you know, you're shooting around and chit chatting with people. And there would be occasional strength training workouts that, you know, we would go to this gym. And, you know, one of the nights, these guys were, you know, coach was putting them through their paces and they're like running wind sprints and doing all these plyometric things. And there was like a kind of or like a cooperative element where, you know, someone had to finish and the next person went, and then I just like hopped into the drill with people and was, you know, scrambling around and doing all the stuff. And the guys definitely thought it was very funny that I just like threw myself, you know, like, you know, these are people in their prime physical fitness, and I, you know, I still play a lot of sports and do a lot of athletic pursuits, but I'm several decades past where they are in terms of their physical fitness. And I think they appreciated that I was game to just throw myself in and embarrass myself in terms of like getting out hustled by these, you know, 17-year-olds. And I think at that point, there was a level of just kind of like, oh, this guy's just gonna be hanging out and doing the same stuff we do, and he's like kind of an idiot, but seems relatively harmless.
How did you navigate the research and the reporting of it? You know, the participatory element of jumping in the drill line and then pulling someone aside to interview them, or and then curating or just like transcribing all that information. Like, how did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I spent so the you know the article covers a year, you know, a year's worth of one season, and I'd made contact with the team before that, and then spent that what, you know, turned out to be somewhat tumultuous season with the team. So that was 2019, and I was planning to continue the project, and then COVID, you know, came along and very much disrupted things. But I, you know, so I had all these notebooks and recordings filled, but for a little while thought, you know, the project had just, I don't know, you know, COVID kind of scrambled a lot of things. And there were times where I thought it was dead. And but then I just stayed in touch with the team and the players and the coach. And then once things, you know, probably 2022, kind of got back involved with the team as, like, you know, normal activities were kind of ramping up again. And I was, you know, kept on, you know, at that point, I didn't even really know what I was doing. I knew I had a lot of just like raw material, but it wasn't in any kind of form yet. And but it was very fun to spend time in this community and with these players. So I just kind of kept hanging out and kept accumulating information and chatting with people. The piece finally came together where, you know, and I think I had reached in the COVID years, as I probably a lot of people did. You know, I reached points where I was like, "What am I doing with my life? Like, what I'm a fake journalist. I'm a fake writer. You know, like, what am I doing? I don't know." And then at a certain point, I was like, "All right, I need to do something with this project." And I kind of got reinvigorated with it, and at that point, I realized there was kind of this weird secret benefit by this gap, And that I had originally conceived of this thing as just like I was going to spend 2019 working with the team, and then it was going to be something after that. And then by the time kind of the COVID disruption had passed and I was back involved, and then I realized like I had, you know, known these guys for years at this point, and I had, you know, seen them finish high school and were off into, you know, their own lives doing different things. And suddenly I realized it had actually become a more interesting project having this like real longitudinal span of information and seeing, you know how things look when you're in that season, and then the perspective you get, you know, a couple years on. And at that point I applied for this residency at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity in which is out in Alberta. And there's a very cool place out there which I highly recommend to other people doing similar work, that they had a literary journalism residency that I applied for and got to spend 2 weeks, I think it was 2 weeks out at this gorgeous campus in the Canadian Rockies. And there was, you know, other people doing this similar residency, and you had people who were kind of like the editor that you were responsible to. During that 2 week period, I went, you know, with all my notebooks, all my tape, everything. And again, so this is how I do things backwards. I had not yet pitched this thing to anyone other than this residency. And so I went out there and essentially like wrote the whole piece fairly close to how it turned out over this 2 week span, where I just, you know, churned through all my notebooks and just like painstakingly organized things into kind of an appropriately narrative form. And it was just like one of those lovely romantic moments that you hear about and pretty rarely get, where like, oh man, I've just got 2 weeks in this incredibly beautiful spot, and I better I better make something happen with this giant pile of notes. And so yeah, just like worked and yeah, kind of got this draft together then.
Structure is so important, and you said, you know, you had all this stuff, you had a lot of things that didn't have any form. So how did you settle on the shape that of the piece that it ultimately came out to be?
I'm a big outliner, and you know I'm a big structural person and organizer. I'm in my personal life, I'm a very tidy person, and I'm like an obsessive list maker and organizer. So I think there's like part of my brain is wired that way. But I just, you know, spent the first pretty much the first week thinking about the structure of this piece, and you know, laying it all out, and then deciding, you know, this piece needed to come a little earlier. One of the most important moments in that process, and this is one of those things that having a good editor to just bounce ideas off of. So the person that I was working with out there is a Canadian writer and journalist named Michael Harris. Early, you know, I'd written maybe 5 or 6 pages, and at that stage you're writing things because you know they're important, and I'm writing up scenes that were kind of disconnected, but you're doing it, you know, you write something because you're like, this is important. Maybe it's not fully conscious why it is. And so I showed him a few pages, and he picked out this one scene and was like, oh yeah, this is really great. I see how this kind of works as the, you know, this thematic underpinning for the piece. And I was like, oh yeah, I also see that, which I definitely did intentionally. I'm glad you too see it. And then I went back and I was like, oh yeah, that is like, I wrote that scene for a reason. I didn't fully consciously know when I wrote it, like why I had written it. And then, you know, just getting that little piece of feedback helped me shape the rest of the piece and help me kind of like tie in this theme that kind of wove through the sections. And it was the scene that comes, you know, fairly early on, of this kid who's a freshman on the team who's just getting like worked over in practice and just like knocked down over and over again. And it kind of is just like this through line that comes back and then kind of comes into to wrap at the end. But yeah, just having one little piece of guidance from, you know, an outside reader who's a very smart reader really helped shape the project for me. And I think the best editors that I've worked with are, in a way, the most hands off, but have that, you know, just have that kind of big picture insight for what things, or I mean, not even big picture, but like pick out a tiny little detail and see how important it is. That, right, when you're gathering all this information, there's so much stuff that you're gathering, and all of it at the time seems kind of equally important. And it takes a, you know, a real sharp-eyed person to be like, no, that thing that you got right there, that's the thing. And it's incredibly valuable.
And when you were reporting and writing this piece, over the time you spent with it, what about it, just over the course of your research and reporting, like what really energized you about this project, be it the writing or the reporting or some combination of the two?
I mean, at the end of the day, I find that, you know, the writing of things to be very fun. I know some, you know, sometimes people feel very agonized about that. And, you know, sometimes you can't figure out how you're trying to do something and it kind of sucks. But I find in general writing to be really fun. The way my projects go, you know, sometimes I hear about fiction writers, poets, and people who, you know, say like, I'm writing every day, I'm doing a little bit of this, you know, every day, I'm touching my project every day. And it's not the way that I work. And sometimes I wish it was, but it's just kind of not the nature of my work. But you know, so I spend so much time accumulating, and I think that develops its own energy in a way where it's like you're building up all these details, and I can kind of feel something exciting coalescing. And then when it's, you know, it's almost like this little bit of withholdingness of, you know, I need to sometimes find the time when life is, you know, not too busy, where I can actually focus. And then when I can get to that moment where I have some space to be focused and clear headed, and I know I've got all this material kind of built up, it's just really fun to work at, you know, putting it down the right way. So I find the actual process of writing very enjoyable, even though sometimes it'll be months if I'm, you know, there's some semesters where I'm teaching or doing other things. And so there's times where I won't be actually writing anything at all for a long time. Those, of course, are sometimes the dark times where you're like, what am I doing? I'm a pretend writer. But then when you get to those places where you can just go for it, I find it very fun. But also, you know, just the reporting of this specific piece was very energizing. It's just, you know, it's just fun to be around this kind of, I've played some sports, you know, casually and non-casually for most of my life. And I'm very energized in those kind of team settings when, you know, the off field, off court, just the banter and the kind of connections you make with people, that kind of world is just energizing to me in general. So getting to hang out with this team and these players for so long and just be in that world was very energizing, and it just felt fun. Like, I'm doing work at the same time, just hanging out with these kids.
And yeah, that being energizing, what about the work do you find that you struggle with or challenging at times?
Mainly it's those times of doubt. I think it's just easy to you talk with other people who are writers and they have their own systems, and sometimes you just see how other people work and you're kind of like, oh, I wish I could do that, or I wish I had that that discipline. Although I think of myself as a fairly disciplined person when I come to the writing itself, but I think ultimately it's an easy profession to doubt yourself and just feel uncertain about what you're doing. Like, there's I remind myself all the time, maybe too frequently. You're like, there's no one out there just like dying for my next thing.
Right.
There's no one out there begging me for this next project. I'm doing this because I care about it and because it gives me great satisfaction. But it's easy, I think, in those moments when you're like, yeah, no, no one is begging for this to be in the world. And it's sometimes easy to just be like, what am I doing? Why, why am I spending so many hours doing this? But ultimately, it's just, I mean, it comes back to being fun for me. So that, I mean, I think the main challenges for me are those feelings of doubt about your projects.
Mm. Yeah, how do you work through that eventually?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that is most energizing when I'm not in the midst of a project is I do spend a lot of time reading, and that helps. I think that kind of I feel consoled where if I'm at some kind of lull, um, I will spend a lot of time just reading for and mostly for pleasure, although the overlap between pleasure and professional is often usually fairly thin. So if I'm not like deeply invested in something, I spend a lot of time reading, and I and it's like one of those cheats where like I'm spending a couple hours a day reading because I really love this book, but I'm really secretly working by spending these hours reading. I'm actually working. And then, if you get, you know, if you find a book that you love, I get so inspired by, it helps. You got, nice caffeine buzz going in the morning, and I'm way into a book, and I feed off the energy of other people's projects. I'll be reading something and loving it, and that will make me feel like, yeah, I want to do the same thing. I want to, or I want to do my own thing differently. But I find that during those lulls, during those times of doubts, I really invest in reading, and that energizes me and makes me, excited about writing the stuff.
Yeah, and then the danger, and I think I've matured out of this to some extent. I tend to be kind of a bitter, jealous person at times, and I've gotten to the point where I will be inspired by someone's piece instead of being like, fuck, I wish why can't I do something like this? How did this person get this opportunity? And they're so damn young, and it just how have you reached a point where maybe you're not necessarily comparing yourself, but you are getting that inspiration hit that you talked about a moment ago?
Yeah, I think, I mean, thankfully I'm I'm pretty good at not not comparing myself against other people. That I can't take any credit for it. I don't think I haven't necessarily done any work to get to that place.
Mm-hmm.
It's just I think like kind of some of my internal wiring is I don't I mean, yeah, everyone I think everyone in a field like this feels competitiveness to some extent, or
Right.
find some ways to fuel themselves. Thankfully, I don't find it too much in that like comparative, like if anything, the kind of, I don't know what to call this, the thing that fuels me in a slightly maladaptive or negative kind of way is, when you, I mean, you get so many no's in this industry, so many people say no to you. It's just like part of life. But I do sometimes feed on that, in a, I think in a productive way, where it's, someone says no to you and you're like, I'll show you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like a
So I try
player
to,
like getting drafted. Like Tom Brady was the 199th pick in the 2000 draft, and
yeah.
he used all that, and so many players use it as motivation. All of you passed on me. I'm going to show you you're wrong.
Yes, yes. There is a part of, maybe I don't like to admit it too much, but there is a part of me that is wired like that, where um yeah, that I can find that motivating in a positive way without, I so far I haven't gotten too bogged down into the kind of like negative aspect of that. But it can add some good fuel to the, yeah. It's like, I'll show you. You'll you'll regret saying no.
Oh, that's great. Well, one thing I love ending these conversations on is like getting a recommendation of some kind for the listeners out there, and it can just be anything that you're excited about that brings you joy, makes your life easier. So I would just extend that to you as we bring our conversation down for a landing.
This has been on my mind. I don't know why it came up exactly, but I'd been, I as a reader, even though I, exclusively write nonfiction, as a reader, I am probably 95% a reader of novels and fiction. And I first of all, I think that's maybe secretly a good thing in terms of like cross pollinating your writing with other genres,
Definitely, yeah.
of letting those other forms fuel what you're doing. I mean, I read pretty, like, plenty of magazine nonfiction as well too, but pretty much in terms of book length stuff, I just read novels for the most part. I had been, I think, like, the kind of novels that I gravitate to, I realize I really respond to funny books,
Mm-hmm.
to novels that are humorous, and while also being serious. I feel like, every time I read about, see some critic mentioning such and such is one of the funniest books I've ever read, and I'll go to that book and I'll be like, this book is not funny. Like, this is like a serious, New York publishing MFA world kind of person who, like, put one wry joke in their book, and that that qualifies as like being one of the funniest books of the year. But so I recently been compiling kind of a mental list of just the funny books that I think are like sincerely funny books, that are also serious books. And especially kind of in the current moment, feel like it's good to have this element of, it's escapist, but I think these books are very engaged with the world. But it's nice in darker moments to have some things that kind of brighten yourself. So I've been thinking of just really funny novels that I love. So I had pulled together a few of just recommendations for people who are looking for, just for something to make them laugh.
Oh, this is
They,
great. They funny novels are hard to come by, so yeah,
they're
I'm
they're
interested in these titles
they're
too.
tricky. But so from this is one I read in the last year. Big Swiss by Jen Began is one of the funniest and also dirtiest books maybe I've ever read. It's huge recommendation for that one. Miriam Taves is a Canadian novelist, and she has written about one of the. It's a book about her. sister's suicide. I don't understand how someone took a topic so heavy, and it is like a sincere engagement with this topic, and it is also like incredibly funny. And that, I think, is like a magic trick that I don't understand even remotely how to do. How someone can take extreme personal tragedy from their life and make a book that is at times incredibly funny. But she's just a great writer in general, and had a kind of semi sequel-ish book to it called Fight Night, which also is very, very funny. I think this is, again, heavy topics. Paul Beatty wrote, I think, the funniest book about structural American racism that a human being could possibly do, called The Sellout, which a couple years ago now, I think it won the Booker Prize. But that, I mean, it's got to be on the funniest Booker Prize winning book ever. Booker Prize, not well known for their belly laughs, but that one is very good. And then pretty much anything the Irish writer Kevin Barry writes is just hilarious, incredibly profane things. Is the way that the Irish have a special gift for. But his most recent book is called The Heart in Winter, and another recent one, Night Boat to Tangiers, very great, and Beetlebone. He's got a whole bunch of very funny novels that are also hilariously profane books. And then my final recommendation, this is this is a bit older, but Charles Portis, who he's most famous for True Grit, which is not a particularly funny book, but an engaging story. He has a few other novels that are just fantastic and hilariously weird. One called The Dog of the South, and then one called Gringos. Those two are very, very strange, very wry, funny books. So that's my kind of short list of books that are, I think, legitimately hilarious and also serious works of literature, for potentially for a balm in our darker times. That is what I offer up.
What was the first title from Miriam that you said?
Oh, it's called All My Puny Sorrows.
All My Puny Sorrows.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, what a great list. And I gotta say, I know we didn't dig into like the bones of American Boys, but I enjoyed so much reading it, and I can't wait for people to head to The Believer and check it out, because it's such a cool piece that is like Darcy Frey's The Last Shot. It echoes that. It's got that same kind of pulse to it, and a lightness of your narration in there and your experience through it. So it's it was such an amazing piece, and I'm so glad I got to read it, and we got to kind of talk a bit about it and talk about a lot of other things too, Will.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a real pleasure to be talking with you. And I will say this, you referenced earlier people taking inspiration from music, and you mentioned the Master of Puppets. And this whole time, I know I technically can't hear it right now, but I've been hearing the riffs from the podcast music in my head this whole time. And that really had me pumped up for this conversation to know that those riffs were going to be involved.
Oh, fantastic. Sweet. Yes. Thanks to Will and you, the listener, for sticking with the show, sticking it out. Thanks to the Power of Narrative Conference for promotional support. We're getting down to it. A couple weeks away. Consider pre-ordering The Front Runner and signing up for that new Substack, Creative Nonfiction Podcast Substack.com. I got a few notes of feedback from listeners about me thinking about changing elements of the show, making it tighter, a lot tighter. And one listener thought I was going to issue elements of craft and process and throw it out the window. They were not happy. I never meant that. That's the strength of the show, really. I also was worried about the length of the show. And this one listener said the length is just fine. Another listener assured me just to follow my taste, keep staying the course. The length is good. So, all right, I think that's probably enough evidence I need to more or less keep it in cruise control. Well, that sounds like I'm getting complacent with it, but you know what I mean. You gotta just keep it going on a true line. And I'm not looking to change things just to change things. I like my little asides and interjections, but not everyone's crazy about them. I stole that idea from Allie Ward of the Ologies podcast. I like them as they provide context and clarity and fact-checking and an occasional joke that I find funny. Also, in a podcast space where interviews are a dime a dozen, the only thing separating one from another is the host or the host personality and taste and voice and style, just like writing. If you can read something that AI generates, then what's the point? And so sometimes I feel the interjections are a way of imbuing and injecting a bit more of my personality and style and making the interview mine and my stamp on it. In the same way that if you wrote an essay, you're putting your stamp on it. Anyway, all of this is to say, in nearly 500 of these, I'm still looking for ways to improve, to get better as an interviewer, to be tighter in my questioning, so I don't have to rely on the edit to cut me down. I still think 45 to 55 minutes is a nice sweet spot to hit. But if I have someone like an Elizabeth Rush on the show, and she's just this rainbow of light embodied, I'm going to let that one ride because I so enjoy her company. And some people is like pulling teeth to get them to talk and think at length. But when you get Bryn Jonathan Butler all wound up, you just let the man cook. All of this is to say, the show isn't going to change so much as it'll continue to mature. My questions, I hope, will get tighter, more open-ended. I think I do a good job of that for the most part, but can always improve. I need to be better at following up on things. Don't always follow up, but you don't want to follow up so much that the conversation stalls on one topic for 20 minutes, unless that topic is so arresting. And this is the calculus of you play as the time unspools. All right, listen, I got a jet. I got another one of these to package today. So let's just stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.